Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Lessons and Legacies of the War on Terror, 2 decades plus later, book talk and panel. My name is Sameen Piracha, and I am the Senior Development Strategist for the Muslim Counterpublics Lab. We are excited that you could join us for this important and timely conversation and reflection on Islamophobia and the foundations of the War on Terror 21 years after the tragic events of September 11th. Tonight's event is brought to you by Muslim Counterpublics Lab and the Muslim Justice League. Muslim Counterpublics Lab is a grassroots community building organization that addresses and challenges systems of oppression rooted in Islamophobia, as well as state and state-sanctioned violence through research, writing, organizing, and direct victim-centered support. Our mission is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. Muslim Justice League was founded on the principles that discrimination towards any group endangers the rights of all, and that Muslim advocacy is an essential force for promoting justice. Its mission is to organize and advocate for communities whose rights are threatened under the national security state in the United States. Led by Muslims, our organizing brings justice for all communities deemed suspect. As the forever war gradually disappears from media headlines, the work of militarism, surveillance, sanctions, and border enforcement continue to expand the US empire against terror abroad. Our amazing panel will contextualize the global war on terror, discussing its history, continuity, and legacy, but also link how policies operating on the domestic and international fronts have served to reinforce each other, resulting in the expansion of US state violence through militarism, policing, surveillance, and incarceration. Our conversation today will begin with and center Dr. Hilal's book, Reflections on Official Narratives that Deployed a Rhetorical Strategy Rooted in Islamophobia, which have served to justify unchecked state violence. We'll also discuss the parameters of the war on terror, how it has been executed in addition to strategies for dismantling the war on terror and abolishing the national security state. Wow, that was a mouthful. There is definitely a lot to cover in the time we have together. Like I mentioned, we have an amazing and distinguished panel who will lead us through this discussion. At this point, I would like to introduce all our speakers. As mentioned, this is a book talk, and it's Dr. Maha Hilal, who is the Executive Director of Muslim Counterpublics Lab. Dr. Hilal is a Muslim Arab American and an expert researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia, and author of the book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Her writings have appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, Truth Out, among others. She is the founding executive director of the Muslim Counterpublic Lab and an organizer with Witness Against Torture. She earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. She received her master's degree in counseling and her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Robert Saleem Holbrook is the executive director of the Abolitionist Law Center, a law project dedicated to ending race and class-based discrimination in the criminal justice system and all forms of state violence. Prior to being named Executive Director of ALC, he was its Director of Community Organizing, responsible for expanding ALC into Philadelphia. He also led ALC's campaigns against death by incarceration, life without parole, solitary confinement, and state violence. He has worked with the Center for Constitutional Rights to end death by incarceration sentences in the United States and the National Unlock the Box campaign to end solitary confinement. He is a co-founder of the Human Rights Coalition, an organization with chapters in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh that is composed of family members of prisoners. HRC advocates on behalf of the civil and human rights of prisoners. He is also co-founder of the Coalition to Abolish Death by Incarceration in Pennsylvania, an advocacy group fighting to end life without parole sentences. He sits on the advisory boards of the Amistad Law Project and Youth Arts and Empowerment Project. While incarcerated, Saleem wrote extensively on prison abuse, social injustice, state violence, and juveniles charged and sentenced as adults. His writings were featured in Truth Out, The Appeal, San Francisco Bay View, and Solitary Watch. He was released from prison in 2018 after spending over 2 decades incarcerated for an offense he was convicted of as a child offender. Fatema Ahmad is the executive director at Muslim Justice League, where she leads MJL's efforts to dismantle the criminalization and policing of marginalized communities under national security pretexts. She joined as deputy director in 2017 and increased MJL's focus on organizing within and collaborating across impacted communities to resist and subvert surveillance. Fatema leads the Stop CVE National Coalition and is a leader in abolitionist organizing locally in Massachusetts. She also serves on the board of directors for Political Research Associates, a social justice think tank devoted to supporting movements that are building a more just and inclusive democratic society. And last but definitely not least, Iman Hassan, who is a staff attorney at the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services. After graduating Vanderbilt Law School, Iman started her career as a civil rights attorney. She is a member of Lawyers for Black Lives and actively organizes with the Black Lives Matter movement on racial justice issues. She currently works with families supporting Families Against Police Violence to support Minnesota families who have been directly impacted by police violence. She is passionate about social justice movements and has experience advocating on behalf of low-income persons to improve access to quality legal services. In 2019, she joined Innocent Classroom as program trainer to change the public education system through the eradication of implicit bias and racial stereotypes, which burden our Black and Brown students. She is currently a staff attorney at the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services, where she works in the Education Law Advocacy Project as a civil rights attorney. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome our presenter, Dr. Hilal.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Sameen, for the introduction, and thank you to Saleem, Fatema, and Iman for being here tonight to discuss the war on terror and the fact that we are now 21 years into it. And thank you as well to Rashida, who is our lovely ASL interpreter for this event. So I'm going to start and just quickly share my screen. So just give me a second. Okay, great. So this book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, is really a culmination of the work in doing research, writing, advocacy, organizing, and activism that I've done for over a decade. And one of the things I really wanted to impart in the book was the ways in which the war on terror has been deeply rooted in Islamophobia and how that has impacted Muslims and Muslim Americans. Whenever I talk about the war on terror, I go back to this quote from President Bush, who spearheaded the apparatus that we now know as the war on terror. So 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, Bush gave a speech to a joint session of Congress in which he used the phrase war on terror for the first time. And I highlight this because when we look back in retrospect, what Bush is defining here in terms of this war not really having a conceivable end is that the war on terror was meant to be nebulous and never ending. And last year, on the 20th year anniversary of both 9/11 and the war on terror, one of the questions that kept coming up was that of how did we get to where we are today? And to me, this is the starting point of how we got to where we are today. In addition to utilizing and using the phrase war on terror for the first time, you can see that part of the speech, he talks about justice. And I'll go into this a little bit later. But what he's essentially defining here is that justice is whatever the United States says it is. In other words, there isn't an objective measure of what justice is. It's simply that the United States claims something is justice, and then it is. This is a quote that President Biden gave that's from a speech President Biden gave this year when he was announcing the assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was the leader of Al-Qaeda. And this quote, like many others in the trajectory of the war on terror by Biden's predecessors, really repeats and reiterates the same ideas. Specifically that the United States did not seek out this war on terror, right? It came to us, as he says. And so when this sort of rhetoric and narrative is being used, it's used to disguise the violence that the United States has utilized in response to the idea that the United States is a victim. And not only did we not choose this war on terror, we essentially have no choices in terms of how the United States responds to it. And so really sort of rooting the US's response in these hegemonic narratives of victimhood serves the purpose of legitimizing state violence. So what is the war on terror? For many of us, this might seem like an obvious answer, what it is. When I was writing the book, I wanted to better understand how to conceive of the war on terror in terms of the many facets in which this war has been fought. So I define and think of the war on terror as not narrowly construed to just militarism and warfare abroad, as it is typically defined, but specifically it's broader than that. It's about this multi-dimensional campaign that not only involves policies that are implemented across the world, but which also have domestic dimensions. And our speakers here today will talk a lot about what is happening on the domestic front in terms of the war on terror. As I mentioned, one of the central reasons why I wrote this book was to emphasize the role of institutionalized Islamophobia in the war on terror. Now, there are many definitions of Islamophobia, and the way I conceive of it and conceptualize it in the book is that it's this phenomenon that's officially constructed hate and fear. Some definitions talk about an irrational fear, but I think it's specifically about contrived fear. And this fear and hate is built into structures of the state and for a specific purpose, which is war and repression. And when it comes to Islamophobia, there are very particular constructions of Islam and Muslims that are deployed, whether it's about being barbaric, violent, uncivilized, opposed to normative democratic values, etc. And the result of this Islamophobia is to push and position Muslims outside of our moral boundaries, such that the violence that is leveraged against them becomes acceptable. And we don't have that same sense of injustice when violence visits Muslim bodies. And finally, Islamophobia is a sort of difficult concept to define for many reasons, but including because of the fact that Muslims are a very diverse community and they live at the intersection of multiple identities. However, one of the things I impart and emphasize is that it is specifically about anti-religious animus, so that there is specifically antagonism towards Islam as a religion. So to put sort of some boundaries around the war on terror, I conceptualized a taxonomy in which there are 5 dimensions. And when we talk about dismantling and abolishing the war on terror, part of that necessarily requires an understanding of what, again, is the war on terror and how and where is it being fought. So there are 5 dimensions that I identify, including militarism and warfare, draconian immigration policies, surveillance, federal terrorism prosecutions, and detention and torture. And I talk pretty extensively in the book about each of these dimensions and the sort of laws and policies that have emerged and the violence that's been inflicted on Muslim and other marginalized communities in the course of fighting the war on terror. So there's also an element that I look at which are the modes of violence. So how specifically is violence leveraged against communities? So there are five modes: corporeal, bordered, panoptic, juridical, and carceral. Corporeal violence is a part of militarism and warfare, and it's where the state exercises its control of the means of violence directly through the infliction of both psychological and physical harm, as well as death, including by the military. And you can see in this picture, in the corner, there's a quote from President Obama, who talks about and is proud of the fact that he says he's really good at killing people. This is a quote that is sort of emblematic of the attitude and violence, again, that has been visited on Muslim bodies. Then there's bordered violence. So bordered violence is also a direct exercise of state power in terms of sovereignty, but here control of physical borders is leveraged against targeted groups through coercion, such as by restricting immigration or conditioning status on cooperation with state objectives. And borders are also about adjudicating humanity. Who deserves to be here or anywhere, and who doesn't? And what does that say about their humanity? Panoptic violence, using surveillance. The state uses its power to surveil in order to control targeted groups by denying them the autonomy inherent in the ability of a person to conduct a private life with the certainty that the state, at least, is not a threat to their safety. Some of you might remember what this tweet in this picture is about. In case you're not familiar with this story, the story was of a young Black Muslim boy named Ahmad who brought a clock that he had built by himself to school, and the teachers decided that it was a bomb and called the police, and he was handcuffed and arrested at school. While President Obama's tweet seems to be inviting and seems to be celebrating Ahmed, the irony, of course, and I know Fatema will be addressing surveillance specifically, is that President Obama really spearheaded the Countering Violent Extremism program, through which this sort of suspicion was allowed to fester and grow. And specifically, suspicion of Muslim communities. Juridical violence, which is including but not limited to federal terrorism prosecutions. In this context, juridical refers to the procedural power of the state to deny its victims legal recourse, including by barring access to the justice system altogether, or by wielding the judicial process against them. And in this picture, I included a quote from a man named Tariq Mahanna, who was charged with material support for terrorism. I encourage you to read about his case and to specifically read the statement he made during his sentencing hearing, because it says a lot about the ways that Muslims have been victimized for free speech, thought crimes, and the list goes on. Carceral, which is in the form of detention and torture. So carceral refers to the state's physical control over the bodies of its victims, which facilitates the ability to inflict harm in various ways, from the psychological harm of being detained, often indefinitely and without cause, to the use of torture. And there is, of course, some overlap between carceral and corporeal violence. In this picture, you can see that there's a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, and this is a quote that was written on one of the torture memos. And Donald Rumsfeld hand wrote this note, condoning not just the tactics that were identified in the memo, but as you can see in this quote, asking why these torture tactics are not more severe. And this is the violence, again, that has been allowed to thrive, that has been justified and legitimized by the US government because of the demonization and criminalization of Muslim communities. I argue in the book, and this is something we do in the work of Muslim Counterpublics Lab, that narrative plays a very specific role in justifying and legitimizing state violence. The narratives that have been deployed post 9/11 are specifically meant to engender support for policies and laws, again, criminalizing Muslims and other marginalized communities. So there are a few that I identified in the book, including the idea that everything changed post 9/11. And of course, this is based on the US's hegemonic narrative that everything changed. When various presidents have talked about and sort of drawn on this narrative, the idea is that there was a world before 9/11 and a world after 9/11. And of course, this is the case solely because the United States was a victim of violence, not because the entire world had experienced something significant. So in this, the United States essentially is giving itself the power to utilize, again, certain tactics because of this new world, that something has changed fundamentally. Then there's narratives around civilization and freedom. Not only are these about and constructed as the reasons why the United States was attacked on 9/11, it's also about the United States' unique obligation to go to countries and spread this democracy and freedom. And this narrative and this rhetoric obviously has been used when we look at the US's war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and in many other examples of the violence, again, that the United States has deployed. Malleable justice. So I talked about this in the beginning with Bush's quote, and I'll go into it in just a second, a little bit deeper. But really, again, the idea here is that justice is whatever the United States says it is. And that it is not up to anyone, whether it's an individual, organization, or another state, to critique what the United States considers as justice. There's this narrative of Muslim humanity and rage. First of all, in order to inflict this level of violence that Muslims have been subjected to in the war on terror, there has been serious dehumanization. And that has been an intentional rhetorical strategy. Whether it's talking about Muslims as being evil, inherently terroristic, barbaric, etc. And then rage. The idea that Muslims are inexplicably angry and there's nothing we can do to understand why that is. There's a utility in this narrative, which is that you cannot reason with people that are inexplicably angry and rageful, and therefore the only possible intervention is brute force. And the United States has relied on that time and time again. And finally, terrorism and moral equivalencies. The idea that terrorism is defined by the state has a monopoly on the definition of terrorism, and that it gets to decide what forms of violence are legitimate and what forms of violence are not, by virtue of not any sort of objective measures, but by virtue of who the actor is. So these are 3 quotes from Biden, Trump, and Obama. In the first quote, Biden is referring to the assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri. In the second quote, where Trump is talking about justice, he's referring to the assassination of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And in the last quote from President Obama, he's referring to the assassination of Osama bin Laden. The interesting thing here is not just that these are assertions that justice has been delivered or done, but also, for example, if you happen to read Biden's speech the speech he delivered in announcing the assassination of Ayman al-Zawahiri, he didn't mention the legalities or the legal rationales that would condone or make this sort of action legal. And that's because of this justice narrative, that the United States simply, again, has to say it's justice, and then it doesn't really matter what's legal or not. And of course, even if the United States the government provided legal rationales or explanations that would justify this kind of violence, it would not be a genuine effort, because the objective, and throughout the war on terror, when it comes to adjudicating justice, there's a particular goal in mind. And what justice is meant to be answered in terms of what we want justice to look like. And in most cases, that has resulted in injustice for Muslims. Here are some examples of both earlier headlines and later headlines that rely on this trope of Muslim rage. None of them are particularly interesting because they all, again, default to the same basic premise that we don't understand why they're angry. Colonialism ended. There's not really any active violence coming from Western countries. And so again, it's unclear why Muslims are so angry. And there's a level of dehumanization that comes with this particular trope, because it reduces Muslims' feelings and emotions to one particular one, which is rage. Terrorism. This is a quote from the former British ambassador. And what has often been the case in the war on terror is that terrorism is defined in tautological ways. It's very circular. So in this quote, Sir Jeremy Greenstock says what looks, smells, and kills like terrorism is terrorism. That does not offer any meaningful ideas or concepts of what terrorism specifically is. But it does provide a guise under which counterterrorism and the tactics employed through counterterrorism frameworks become legitimate. Because we know what terrorism is, and it is our definition of what terrorism is that is guiding counterterrorism strategy. Moral equivalencies. In this quote from President Bush, he says, if there's any comparison between the compassion and decency of the American people and the terrorist tactics of extremists, it's flawed logic. It's just, I simply can't accept that. It's unacceptable to think that there's any kind of comparison between the behavior of the United States of America and the action of Islamic extremists who kill innocent women and children to achieve an objective. Clearly, in this quote, President Bush is trying to separate state violence from non-state actor violence, and to specifically and explicitly assert that state violence is inherently moral and superior to non-state actor violence. And it is that way because we said it was. When we look at what Bush is specifically identifying, killing innocent women and children, the United States has killed plenty of innocent women and children. And there has also been an objective for this kind of violence. So there is really nothing that separates the violence of the United States from the violence of non-state actors, insofar as this quote is concerned. Other than, again, this basic assertion that state violence is inherently superior and more moral, actually only moral, whereas non-state actor violence is not. When it came to the war crimes that happened at Abu Ghraib in 2004, we talk about state violence. These are three responses to those war crimes from President Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, and Colin Powell. In each of these quotes, as you can see, for example, in Bush's quote, he says that that behavior does not represent the America he knows, and that this America that he knows cares about people. Rumsfeld specifically saying that the United States is a superior country because at the end of the day, it adheres to the rule of law. And then finally, Colin Powell celebrating what he imagines or imagined the response would be, that the United States would sort of do the right thing. Now, of course, we know that all of these statements are false. But why I emphasize them is for two reasons. One is because what's noticeably absent is any mention of the victims and those who were harmed at Abu Ghraib. And second, why I refer to this as not a dent in the narrative is because no matter what sort of violence the United States directs or is complicit in, the narrative remains the same. We are still the same country regardless of systematic and systemic violence. And this is unchanging, which is one of the biggest problems and one of the hardest things to challenge when it comes to this narrative. In 2006, when 3 Guantanamo prisoners were alleged to have died by suicide, the response from Rear Admiral Harry B. Harris, who was at the prison at the time, said they are smart, they are creative, they are committed, they have no regard for life, either ours or their own. I believe this was not an act of desperation, but an act of asymmetrical warfare waged against us. I include this quote because it illustrates, again, how dehumanized Muslims have been in the war on terror. In most cases, you could understand why individuals who were indefinitely detained without charge and who were subjected to torture might feel desperate and might resort to, for example, suicide. But because of the level of dehumanization, instead, their suicides, or their alleged suicides, are treated as an act of war. So even post-mortem, they are constructed as a threat. In 2012, when there was a massacre in Afghanistan, President Obama responded that this was just a lone gunman. And of course, it's not representative of the United States. And the men and women in the military, right, have made enormous sacrifices. But we must ask, sacrifices for who? The Afghans who died in the course of the US war on their country, or the Afghans who remained to watch their country be continually destroyed? This is a speech, or a quote from a speech that President Biden gave last year when the US was withdrawing from Afghanistan, and there was an attack by a group named ISIS-K. And throughout the narratives and sort of the media focus on this attack, the number of American troops who were killed was consistently mentioned. There were 13 American troops who were killed, whereas the number of Afghan civilians who were killed remained nebulous and unmentioned. And that is another specific strategy to minimize the violence. And it's as if a country as powerful as the United States does not have the capacity to count the number of its victims, which we know is not true. So I'm going to try to move really quickly through the rest because I want to give the panelists time to speak. But I also looked at internalized Islamophobia. And internalized Islamophobia is really about absorbing these problematic narratives of Islam and Muslims that are extremely pervasive. And when it becomes a significant problem is when this internalization leads to Muslims participating in the national security state that inevitably harms and targets Muslims. Let me just go through a couple of examples. A couple of years ago, there was a video from BuzzFeed in which the Muslims in the video, the premise of the video was, I'm Muslim, but I'm not, for example, angry. I'm Muslim, but I like Thanksgiving. So presumably what these people were responding to were all the problematic narratives and stereotypes that existed of Muslims. But the problem is when you engage in this kind of rhetorical counter narrative is that you're actually reiterating and giving credence to the dominant narrative. These two examples are from a project that was created by a local mosque. And you can see in the two corners that they both say Muslims are an integral part of the American fabric and we oppose extremism in any form. In the first example, on the left-hand corner, there are two visible Muslims, and the signs say terrorism has no religion, and I am Muslim. But of course, if terrorism has no religion, why are there only Muslims in the picture? And second, dear God, tell them I'm not a terrorist. This is a young Black girl who looks to be about 10 years old. And now, instead of seeing her as a young girl, by refuting and using this narrative that she is not a terrorist, you're actually responding to the dominant narrative that she is a terrorist. In other words, internalized Islamophobia means that you are not creating or constructing yourself outside of what the dominant narrative says about Muslims. I'm going to skip these because we're running late. So this is the second to last slide, and what I want you to notice here is there are two quotes. In the first, from President Bush, he says, "Our nation saw evil." This was on 9/11. And in the second quote, Obama says, "We can't erase every trace of evil from the world, and small groups of killers have the capacity to do great harm." The picture that's juxtaposed against these quotes is one of graffiti from Yemen, in which it's written, "Why did you kill my family?" And the point of this is that the United States has taken the liberty to define people as evil, which is an inherent characteristic. And when we look at the violence that's been exacted on Muslims, couldn't we also say that this is evil? The use of drone strikes to kill innocent people. But it is about who gets to define the terms on which the war is fought. And whoever has the power to leverage these narratives has the power to exact violence and justify it at the same time. And then finally, after 21 years and counting, it is time to dismantle and abolish the war on terror. Thank you all very much. Sameen, we can't hear you.
You would think that after 2 years, I would understand how to do this. Thank you, Dr. Hilal. That was very powerful and informative. Before I invite our panelists to share their reflections on the presentation, I wanted to quickly share a few things that came up for me. Dr. Hilal, as you shared in your book and presentation, the narrative framework developed at the outset of the war on terror made the codification and institutionalization of Islamophobia quite easy, which have led to very discriminatory laws and policies, such as the Patriot Act, Muslim registries, countering violent extremism programs, and the Muslim ban, to name a few. I can't help but reflect that this targeting of a specific group of people in a time of national emergency or under the guise of public safety, based on a putative national or religious affiliation with the enemy, seems to be embedded in the history of the United States. This othering and demonization of Muslims has led to gross injustices in the criminal legal system, with a clear concern emerging about the willingness of the state to set aside constitutional protections because a group of individuals is deemed unworthy of protection. As we often ask in the criminal justice space, is the justice system broken, or is it working precisely how it was designed? Similarly, is the war on terror about rooting out terrorism, or is it a mechanism put in place to enact state violence and protect and grow the American empire abroad and at home? Just something to think about as we hear from our other panelists. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Robert Saleem Holbrook.
Thank you. As I reflect on 21 years after the 9/11 attacks, many of the things that I think about is how the United States used this tragedy, this attack, to launch itself, to launch upon the world an unending war that it defined as a war on terror, but actually was a war on Muslims around the world. It was actually a war on self-agency of Muslims around the world, and particularly of Muslims in countries that were propped up, despotic countries, authoritarian countries that were propped up by the United States in the Muslim world for decades, that created the conditions, that created the opposition to the American presence and interference in these countries' affairs, that led the world to the road to 9/11. And the way the United States used victims to create more victims around the world, to not take that moment to actually look in the mirror, but instead just unleashed upon the world death, destruction, destabilization. When we look at the long trail of abuses from 9/11, if the United States set out to break the Muslim world, to dismantle the world order, that's its legacy from 9/11, in addition to the heaps of bodies on both sides. Another thing that really comes to mind too is how, in addition to unleashing this mass violence after 9/11, another thing that was unleashed upon the world, that was unleashed upon people who were swept up in the dragnet, the global dragnet that the United States used, an indiscriminate dragnet. Let's not forget that after 9/11, thousands of innocent Muslims were detained across the country, were essentially disappeared within the United States within weeks of 9/11, but also around the world. When we think of the illegal rendering, the black sites where people were kidnapped in countries, that allegedly or supposedly are friends of the United States, in Italy, Britain, all across Europe. And then many of these countries even allowed these black sites, these prison sites, these secret prisons to exist on their soil, where people's human rights were completely disregarded, and where, according to US law, they didn't exist. When we look at Guantanamo Bay, when we look at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, the brutal treatment that detainees were facing, the United States did not have to travel across the world to learn these tactics, how to torture people, to how to degrade and how to humiliate people. Rather, the United States was busy for years practicing this degradation and this torture within its own borders. And one of the things the United States exported in the aftermath of 9/11, in addition to mass violence, was essentially pillars and features of its mass incarceration regime in the United States. And one case in point that I always think of is the infamous Abu Ghraib cases where United States service members were torturing innocent Iraqi detainees. And it was captured on film. Some of them died. Many of them were beaten. Many of them were degraded. But the ringleader of that was actually a correctional lieutenant from the state of Pennsylvania. I dropped a link in the chat that will be coming to the chat soon that talks about how he perfected Charles Grainer, this lieutenant who went over to Iraq as a service member. They put him in charge of a unit in Abu Ghraib because of his experience handling prisoners in the United States. And one of the prisons that he worked in was SCI Green in Pennsylvania, a prison I was in solitary confinement. And I remember him on the unit. And he was the one that always deprived prisoners of their food. He was the one that would always dog prisoners out. He was the one that would always give prisoners false misconduct charges so they could stay in the solitary confinement longer. He just looked for ways to degrade and abuse prisoners. And when he was sent over to Iraq, he took that mindset from what he was doing in Pennsylvania. The difference is in Iraq, he was unrestrained to pursue his sadistic passions. And that is what he did. And so there's an article that should be dropped into the general chat soon that will talk about how he perfected, how he started these series and trains of abuses in prisons in Pennsylvania, and then took that over to Iraq and actually participated in the torture and the training in the Iraqi prisons. Another thing I'll talk about before I close, and I think is the most important thing, is the extrajudicial killings that the United States perfected and continues to perfect, continues to employ across the Muslim world. Extrajudicial killings happening all the time in the United States, with police killing innocent and unarmed people, Black people and brown people. The police forces in the United States kills more people than any other Western police force in the world. It's normalized in the United States. Again, this extrajudicial killing, this feature of the American carceral state and mass incarceration was exported through the drone programs where Muslims were assassinated all across the world. I think of the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, who was an American citizen, but also a lot of people don't know his 16-year-old son was assassinated, and he too was an American citizen under Obama, and there was no outrage over it. And it was really incredible because here the state acted as the judge, the jury, and the executioner in one split second. To this day, the thousands of people who were killed in these drone attacks through these extrajudicial assassinations, they had no due process. They were not tried. They were just deemed enemies of the state and murdered. And so to me, that's some of the lasting effects, and that's just some of the minimal effects of the war on terror and how it has been impacting not just Muslims, but people all across the world. Because remember, what they're doing to Muslims today, they will do to all people who raise their voice to challenging injustice in the world. And that is going to be our challenge going forward in dismantling the national security state in this country. But also, it's going to speak to a larger issue, and that is that maybe it's just not the national security state that needs to be dismantled. Maybe it's the very state itself that should be dismantled. So thank you for having me tonight to talk about this issue.
Thank you, Robert. I'm going to not speak in between our panelists now, just to be mindful of time. And I want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please type them in the comment box. And Shagufta, I've made a note of your question, and I will bring it up after all the panelists have spoken. Next, I would like to invite Fatema Ahmad to speak.
Thank you. It's definitely hard to follow both of those amazing speakers, but I'm glad to be here and glad to be reflecting on this important topic. As Dr. Hilal mentioned earlier, my work focuses predominantly on surveillance, within the 5 prongs of the war on terror that she lays out in her book. That's the main one that my work currently focuses on. But I will say one of, the biggest challenges for me is that even 21 years later, it's so difficult to get people to see the impacts of surveillance and understand how that harms Muslims in the domestic context. It's much harder to organize around the global war on terror and, get people to understand and care about the violence that we perpetuate abroad every day. But I will say, on the surveillance front, and Dr. Hilal, sort of got at this earlier in her presentation, there's been an interesting trajectory in the past 20 years. And I'll say first that Muslimness has always been policed and surveilled for as long as the United States has existed. It is something that predates 9/11, but the war on terror, that official sort of launch, really has intensified it drastically. And let's say the first 10 years, we saw a lot of law enforcement, sort of infiltrating the community through informants, through undercover agents. And this became really obvious, actually, to the community. People will joke about it even, of this person who is overly eager to talk to you about politics, who's new to the mosque, might be an informant. And so the next strategy, given that that wasn't working anymore, was to actually get us to surveil and police ourselves. So Dr. Hilal earlier showed some, comparison quotes from different presidents, which is really great because, for me, one quote that sticks out was during the 2016 elections. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were both asked, essentially during a debate, what do you think of Muslims? And basically they said the same thing. They said Muslims are fine as long as they are reporting on violence in their communities, as long as they are working with law enforcement to find the bad Muslims. No other community is talked about in this way, where it is actually not enough for you yourself to be not violent, to be a good Muslim citizen in the US. You actually are expected to root out the supposed violence in your community and the people around you. That's the next strategy, right? Is to get us to do that to ourselves, and not just within our own communities, but to convince everybody to do that, right? It's taking the campaign, see something, say something, and institutionalizing it through programs. So when we talk about surveillance, sometimes people think it's just about technology, and that could happen to anybody. We're all being surveilled through our phones and so on. But we're really talking about our policies and structures, like fusion centers, like countering violent extremism, actual programs that are doing this, right? And we know who's going to be targeted, right? We know, like Dr. Hilal pointed out earlier, no one can define a terrorist, but we all know who they mean, right? When they say, find the terrorist in your community, right? Find the extremist or the person who's being radicalized. They're talking about Muslims. That's who gets pointed out every time. So this is actually encouraging ourselves, our own communities, to do this to each other. It's convincing everyone around us that this kind of profiling is helpful, right? Everyone is sort of deputized to participate in that surveillance. The one other thing I will say before I try to take it to more positive and future outlook, Saleem brought up actually Abu Ghraib, and that, one of those perpetrators, really one of the people leading it, worked at a correctional institute in Pennsylvania. This is actually very personal for me because he and the other, people who did that, actually that military, troop was out of my hometown. So they were all based out of my hometown in Western Maryland. And that is a place where there's multiple prisons. It's a population of under 20,000 people, but we have 3 prisons. And that's the only way that the population goes up, actually, is incarcerated people. So I personally grew up with that, knowing and actually seeing that direct link of people either, working at the prisons locally or joining the military and going abroad, and understanding at a deep level how that's connected. And I think that's really important for our work, is to make those connections, right? To understand, as Saleem was saying, like how the global war on terror is so deeply intertwined with policing and prisons domestically here in the US. We have to know that. We have to work on these things side by side or directly together. And so I'll say, on the positive side, how we're doing that at Muslim Justice League. One example is locally, we have a fusion center in Boston, which that is totally a war on terror creation. Fusion centers are literally spy centers that started after 9/11 to allow law enforcement to surveil and share information with each other freely. And our local fusion center runs the gang database, which impacts Black and Brown people predominantly. It definitely has Muslims in it too, but most of the people in the gang database, I would guess, are not Muslim. But it's administered by this thing that was justified through Islamophobia, this fusion center. And so what we've done is we've built a really strong coalition around this that understands how these things are intertwined, how these systems are really one system impacting, everyone, right? Whether it's a Somali youth, a Salvadoran youth, Black American youth, they're all being targeted through this same structure, and we can actually come together to organize against it. And that is, I think, why we have been so successful with our organizing here in Boston on that front. So to me, one of the things we have to do is organize across communities, right? Make those direct connections across these systems, across these institutions, so that we can strategically, build that solidarity and come together to dismantle those systems. I could go on forever, but I will stop here so we can hopefully get to some Q&A later as well. But thank you.
Thank you, Fatema. And next, I would like to invite Iman Hassan.
Thank you so much. Just reflecting on some of the things that have been said before, and even just now, what it really means to be under constant surveillance in your community. I think the power of that I have felt myself as a Somali American growing up in Minneapolis in one of the largest diasporas, Somali diasporas. I remember we would always joke when we had newcomers to our mosque, or when we were in big events, we would joke about who was on the FBI payroll or who we thought was an informant. And it was, as children, it was in jest, but you really recognize in your psyche, it's disruptive to community building. It's disruptive to trust that you have to have when you're in spaces that are supposed to allow you to be yourself, to be trusted by others, but also be trusting. And so the panoptic part that Dr. Hilal spoke about is really disruptive and destructive to communities on really micro levels. And then that expands into all the different ways that we cannot build community in the same way that we were before the war on terror started to come to our homes, right? To come to the suburbs of Minneapolis, to come into the courts, to come even into the ways that we as a community were able to transfer money to our loved ones abroad. One of the largest raids that has ever happened at the Somali Mall in Minneapolis was due to the informal money transfers. So hawala, that's how we call it. There are different ways of saying it all over the world. What it is essentially informal ways of transferring money from diasporas to your home country. The largest amount of money is going from family to family directly. It isn't sources of money going to one organization. It's quickly understood by most people, and yet the largest rates that happened were consistently targeting informal money transfers. At one point, they even stopped allowing all of the informal money transfer businesses to bring their money to Wells Fargo and essentially do the normal banking that all informal money transfers were doing, just like Western Union even. So you could see that the unknown, even in just the ways that we allowed our families to survive during times of drought, during times of turmoil and war, was cut off because of the need of surveillance and total knowledge of what we were doing with $100, $200 that even I myself as a student would be sending home to my cousin abroad. And so that disruption was definitely also on the financial level, which is a form of terror because you don't know if you could wake up the next day or the next week and support the family that you've been supporting for a decade, maybe, that is counting on the money that you've been sending back. And many families and many family units were connected in that way, financially connected, emotionally connected. And suddenly now you have the state disrupting it. Even though there are 1,000 other, as someone who has worked in banking, there are 1,000 other different strategies you could use to think about how to structure something in a more comfortable way. But what we didn't do is figure out new regulatory mechanisms because, as Dr. Hilal has perfectly pointed out, it's the uniqueness of Muslims doing something that other people have done for centuries. Informal money transfers aren't anything new. They aren't something that are out of the bounds of regulation, but because it's us participating in it, that suddenly it has to be controlled, stopped immediately. And really what it does is also just a global disruption of people supporting each other at a communal level, right? It's grassroots, actually, instead of big NGOs or the United States allowing people to survive during droughts. It's family members doing it. So really, it's also a disruption of community care. So when we talk about panoptic or carceral, there's so many different ways that I can think about how it has disrupted and really created real patterns of internalization of Islamophobia, both by non-Muslims and also within the community. I think in the book, there's a really, really phenomenal chapter about how do you undo or even just recognize that we ourselves as Muslims have internalized narratives. And Dr. Hilal spoke about weaponized narratives. And so I'm an education lawyer. I deal with children. And the one thing that I love about this cover is the first word is innocent, right? And I think about innocence constantly because we know, and studies have shown, that children as early as 4 years old can internalize negative narratives about who they are, their identities, and how society thinks about them. And with that comes not just stereotype threat, it's a stereotype knowledge that you have. And if children as young as 4 years can internalize that and live based on those, not just if they're not internalizing it, but if they're thinking about, is someone thinking this about me? They're not moving in this world in an innocent way. It disrupts their learning. It disrupts their trust. It disrupts the way that they see justice. And it disrupts their sense of being just free. And so that picture that Dr. Hilal showed with the cop and the young child, the Black young girl, saying, terrorism doesn't have a religion. Imagine being a 5 or 6 year old Black Muslim child in school and seeing something like that. What does that say to that child about the ways that she is spoken about or they're spoken about by society? And so the disruption of that and the undoing of that requires us, one, to know that these narratives exist. And obviously the book does a really great job of giving us a pretty wide knowledge of how some of those have been created, the political tools of why they're created, also both abroad and domestic, the way it intersects with policing, the way it intersects with race. In Minnesota, for example, I think we all are up to date on the policing issues of Minneapolis and Minnesota in general. But one of the things that came out post George Floyd was the largest population of people that were stopped just with cars were Somali boys. Young Somali men were stopped at insane raids by Minneapolis police officers. And so it wasn't just African American, but it was the description of Somali boys and Somali young men, even on campus at the University of Minnesota, is policed at disproportional rates because the fear is like dual, right? The fear of what do these Black Muslim men do in our spaces, both because of their Blackness, but then also because of the narratives that specifically exist due to programs like CVE that we just heard about. These counter surveillance programs have created dangerous narratives about Black boys and specifically Black Muslim men in Minneapolis. And so undoing that requires really to point out the dangerous aspects of what it means to be burdened by these narratives. And I know as an education lawyer, you can't be free as a child and learn when you feel like people have ideas about you that are this dangerous and that can lead to being connected to a carceral system at higher rates, obviously. So I think the structure of just thinking about how these narratives can come into the regulatory sector, into the financial sector, obviously, even when it comes to policing and the way that we have seen Black lives with, for example, Dalal Eid was one of the, he was the very first person killed by Minneapolis police after George Floyd. And one of the first things that Star Tribune, our local paper, was talking about was if he wasn't involved with drugs, or stating, oh, he wasn't involved with anything terrorist related. Could you imagine any other family having to read about the death of their child and randomly connect it to terrorism narratives by just refuting it? Why even add it to the story? Why even add it as something that had to be looked into? It was because he was a young Black Somali man. And so as they were mourning their loved ones, they also had to be blatantly attacked by narratives that are very, very much still used widely in Minnesota about Black boys. People have made careers of it. Prosecutors have moved up the political ladder because of it. And judges feel very protected by the state when they produce very harsh sentences or have intense and very biased moments against Black, brown, Muslim boys and women as well, due to the fact that these narratives are still very much internalized by white America. And so I'm very appreciative that the first word here is innocent, because I think what I work towards is reestablishing the innocence of children. And we can't do that unless we ourselves as a Muslim community, but also as a community of organizers, push back against those narratives and push back against weaponizing narratives that lead to incredible violence without any form of accountability. Because as we've heard here before, maybe the justice system is working exactly with the precision that it was designed to work. So undoing that is definitely one of the things that we must do if we want to reestablish innocence for all children and innocence for ourselves, right? Undoing the narratives for ourselves. So I'm just so happy that I could be part of this conversation, and I could speak for hours about this book, but I just picked up one of the words to start my thoughts on this. So thank you.
Thank you, Iman. At this point, I would like to invite back all our speakers. I know, Fatema, you're not feeling the greatest, so it's okay if you just stay off screen. But we did get a question from Shagufta Hakim. She asked, how does the rise in anti-Asian sentiment or hate also fit in with widening the war on terror? If anybody wants to take that question.
I'll defer to Fatema and Iman.
Yeah, I can take that on. I'm sorry. I would say similar to the general rise in, or perceived rise, actually, in white supremacist and white nationalist violence, there have been a lot of calls for applying counterterrorism or the war on terror to white supremacists and white nationalists. So you'll see people get excited about, let's call them terrorists, right? Let's call these acts of violence terrorism, as if that could ever be decoupled from Muslims. It can't. Like, that's not a term that we're ever going to take back. And I think there are other terms that could be, but not just the terminology, right? The actual apparatus of the war on terror, again, which is, much of this has existed long before 9/11. These tools have always been used to police and surveil Black and brown people and Muslims. And so trying to use them supposedly to tackle white supremacist violence is really both ineffective and harmful, right? It's not actually addressing the root causes of white supremacy, right? Trying to, approach or identify specific individuals or police specific individuals is quite ridiculous when you're asking agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI to do that, right? It's the same agencies that perpetuate white supremacy every day. And that's the part that's harmful, right? You're giving those same agencies more power and the ability to say, well, we're tackling white supremacist violence too. Now we're giving you equal opportunity surveillance, which is just absurd and quite offensive, honestly. So I think we have to find ways, from an abolitionist perspective, we have to find ways to address violence at its root and through real community, right, and community safety without relying on law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I second that. I think the couple attacks on mosques that I experienced, what was counterproductive to me at times with the communities that were impacted was we would speak about the violence that we see by the state done specifically by federal police, FBI, or by state police. And yet the very first thing that the communities asked for was more police presence during prayers, right? And the same police that would be harassing our Somali boys would then be asked by the mosque leaders to be there constantly. And so to me, it was bizarre, right? Like, I think it is a natural reaction to think of we need to be protected just like white suburbs or white churches or white spaces. But is that really the form of protection that we need when we also see terrorism coming from those entities? And so, I mean, I think with the rise of Asian hate, I think what's interesting about that is a lot of these conversations were at the very same time where, at least in Minneapolis, but I think definitely on the national platform as well, at the same time of George Floyd, and a lot of these conversations about not just police reform, but like essentially how can we re-envision community safety and safety in general, right? And so I think there was at times a little bit of friction with communities that envision safety different and have had different experiences with policing as well. Not everyone has the same experience with surveillance. I mean, I think obviously the African-American community has had a very long history with the FBI surveilling them. And so then when you come with the Muslim community experiencing surveillance at these levels as well, detailed surveillance that is disruptive to their communities, obviously you can build community very quickly around surveillance and around policing. And I don't think I mean, obviously the Asian community has experienced the same violence by the state in different parts of history in the United States. But I think we shouldn't think that organizing is that easy with all communities that have very different epistemology and different trauma based on state violence done by white supremacists.
Thank you both for that. I totally agree with you in the sense that we need our communities to be on the same side, and to develop that trust is a huge undertaking, right? Like, we all have our own individual trauma, and then to have collective trauma, and then to be able to push against the forces that have been kind of laid down over centuries is overwhelming. So I guess if there are no other questions from our audience, I would like to pose, so if that is the case, what would it take to abolish the war on terror? Are we going to be able to do it in our lifetimes, or is this something that we kind of create momentum for?
I think it's both. It might happen in our lifetime. We have to act like it could, right? We have to move like anything is possible. That's what we saw in 2020, right, with abolition. In April of 2020, I did not think anyone, a month or two later would be in the mainstream talking about abolishing the police. And it doesn't mean that things drastically changed that summer. We're still fighting the same fight, but we gained some momentum that we weren't expecting. And I think the same thing happened actually in 2021 around Palestine, where I've never seen people take to the streets on Palestine in the way that they did last summer. We still have such a long fight ahead of us, but I think it's possible, and it takes building solidarity. It takes, the really long, unglamorous work of organizing. Organizing is not, having hot takes on Twitter as much as I like to have a hot take on Twitter. It's having really tough conversations with the people around you and moving people towards, this vision of a radically different world.
I think it's looking also very critical of different institutions that have a lot to lose if we undo the very powerful narratives that Dr. Hilal spoke about earlier, right? Specifically our military, American military, and that's how I met Maha, doing work about on behalf of active service members that could no longer be part of the military because they understood that it was against their conscience, and so they would apply to become conscientious objectors. But what I'm saying is the military has a lot to lose if we do not have an entity that is consistently threatening us. Obviously, we have military bases all over the world, so we are really terrorizing everyone, but it's our presence there that allows us to have specific powers, right? Military powers. And I think as long as there is this invisible threat, it can always be justified to put so much of our money into the military. And so I think undoing the way that we see global safety, or we see our role as Americans abroad, or the way that we use our military force to even have economic power, right? Or the way that we do sanctions. It's basically everything that we would have to undo in order for us to really, really decouple from these narratives that exist. Because I think if we undo these narratives and we still have the institutions that rely on some threat to hover over us, then it's just new narratives and new communities that will be victimized, right? That's the one thing I've recognized. And I think something that was so powerful earlier was when Robert explained that these strategies that are used in these really violent moments that I exposed have been used before, right? I saw Minneapolis being brutalized by United States, National Guard and military and police officers. And all of those techniques were used against Indigenous, Dakota, Lakota, Sioux people at Standing Rock. Like literally, it was tried out at Standing Rock, it was perfected, and then it was used in Minneapolis. Violence by the state is never that creative. They have done it before. And so I think the thing that I worry about is if we undo this narrative, but we don't undo the all of the different entities that require the narrative, then we will just create something else.
Thank you. Thank you both for such an insightful conversation and thoughtful reflections. I know Robert had to drop off before, but his contribution to the discussion was also very enlightening. And as all of you have highlighted, this is something that has been around for centuries and just gets passed down and reboxed and repackaged depending on who the current threat seems to be. And it's kind of like a sleight of hand where the threat is put at a distance, but honestly, everything that is being worked behind the scenes is also kind of used at home. So it's not just this boogeyman that exists somewhere out in the distance, but it can actually be someone that looks like us or one of our neighbors. If you're still on, thank you so much. I know we're a little past our time, but I wanted to share, let's see if I can actually share my screen.
Can I just make a quick comment, Sameen?
Sure.
So I just wanted to quickly just offer my thoughts on the question of abolition. And I think, one of the things I tried to do in the book is by sort of describing and conceptualizing the parameters of the war on terror to understand like what we're up against and what it is exactly that we have to dismantle and abolish. Because a lot of times When we talk about abolishing the war on terror, it's not clear exactly what it is that we mean by that. And what is the violence that we have to undo? And then something I think about often is the idea of the war on terror has been sort of nebulous and never ending, right? But also US wars just don't end, right? They just morph into new wars, as I write in the book, that preserve the brutality of wars past. So when we talk about abolishing the war on terror, it also necessarily means abolishing the violence that has preceded the war on terror and the many wars that have been fought against other marginalized communities. So it's a big task, right? And it's something that won't be easy, especially because of how normalized the violence of the war on terror has become in our daily lives. At this point, we can't go to the airport without being subjected to a body scanner, right? Or getting a pat down or whatnot. So it has become such a part of our lives that it's hard to think about what it would mean to extract the war on terror. But as both Fatema and Iman articulated very well, right? We still have to believe that it's possible and work towards the possibility of the war on terror ending, whether or not that seems like it's in sight, and whether or not the US government is ever going to work towards abolishing the war on terror. At least, maybe not abolishing, dismantling, right? And of course, that would only be for purposes of, for financial reasons or other sort of non-human rights related reasons. So it is a big task, and it's something that I'm grateful to be working with Iman and Fatema and folks in other spaces to really think about, what does abolition mean? What does it look like? At what points do we have to interact with the state, and at what points do we need to withdraw in order to get us towards abolition? So I'm not super optimistic, but nevertheless, of course, join others in working towards that goal.
Thank you, Maha. Can you help me figure out how to share the slide? Is it just, how do I do this? Sorry. It's not letting me share my, oh, there you go. Okay, Maha, I'm sorry. I am not able to share the slide, but we wanted to share a preview of Muslim Counterpublics Lab's Shattering Justice and Remaking the Muslim Threat exhibition. It's a living, dynamic digital timeline illustrating the construction, evolution, and impacts of the war on terror on Muslim and Muslim American communities in the aftermath of 9/11 and the onset of the war on terror. It comprehensively details the laws and policies of the war on terror over the last 20 years and is designed to capture the war on terror through Muslims' lived experiences. We were hoping to share the sneak peek of this virtual exhibition, which unfortunately you're not able to see. Oh, maybe Maha figured it out. Yes, thank you so much. As you can see in this sneak peek of the virtual exhibition, it contains stunning and visceral imagery that makes visible how deeply rooted Islamophobia has been and is in the post-9/11 national security apparatus. If you are in Washington, D.C., you can see more of this exhibition when you join us at Muslim Counterpublics Lab's launch party next Thursday at 7 p.m. at the Friends Meeting House in DuPont Circle. For more information, you can visit us at bit.ly, so bit.ly/MCL-launch, and I can put that in the comment. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please follow all of these wonderful people and their organizations on social media. And if you haven't already, go and buy Dr. Hilal's book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim. Again, thank you so much for joining us and have a good evening.